Okay, today we are beginning chapter 6, and we're going to be looking at section 1 over the president because chapter 6 is over the presidency. So as you listen to the lecture, make sure that anything that's in red on the screen that you put into your notes, and then you submit your notes at the end to make sure that you get a good grade for that. Please feel free to stop the video anytime to make sure you have a chance to get in there, get your notes in there, and then any questions you have, please let me know. All right, so let's look at our notes and let's look at what we're going to look at. We talked about how we have 3 different branches of government. We've looked at the Congress, the legislative branch. Now we're going to look at the executive branch, which is the president. The president is the executive branch because he executes the laws and makes sure those things are taken care of. So as we begin our look at what the president is, what they do, that kind of stuff, first question we're going to consider is what are the roles of the president? Well, there are quite a few, and there are some roles that are official, and there are some roles that are unofficial. And so we will look at each one of those and talk about them. The first role that we want to consider of the president is his role as the chief executive. What that means is that it is his responsibility to see that the government programs are carried out and that the laws passed by Congress are implemented. In fact, the Constitution says that the president shall make sure to faithfully execute the law of the land. So when Congress passes a law and he signs it into law, it is his responsibility to carry it out. Even if it's from a previous president, their job is to carry out and execute the laws. Now, one of the things we've seen in modern times is that sometimes presidents don't carry out laws that were passed in the past by previous presidents that they don't agree with, which I think is probably unconstitutional, but they do it. And I mean, other than impeachment, what are they going to do about it? So they get away with it. But anyway, chief executive, his role is to execute the laws of the land. So he's technically the chief law enforcement officer in the country. His second role is that of chief administrator. It's along the same lines as the chief executive, except that he, in this role, he oversees the executive departments, okay? He manages the 15 executive departments and the very numerous federal agencies that help carry out government policy. Now, this is a tremendous task because there are about 2 million people employed with the federal government, and technically their president is their boss of all of them. But they are very hard to manage and hard to control because there are so numerous and so many of them, and they kind of have their own way of doing things. And so the president really, even though he's the chief administrator and controls those, he really doesn't have much to do about that. The third thing we see is that he is the commander-in-chief of the nation's military, which means he has the authority to order troops into action and to call them back home. It's a very significant power, but remember, even as commander-in-chief, he does not have the power to declare war. Only Congress can declare war. He and Congress is the one that funds the military. So they kind of share that power, but part of his power is that he is the commander-in-chief. Now, please keep in mind that when our founding fathers founded the military and put the president as the commander-in-chief, they wanted the military to be under the control of the civilian leader of the country. Because if you have a separate military that is completely under military control, they can exercise power that they shouldn't exercise. So as the commander-in-chief, he is the highest civilian in the land, highest ranking civilian in the land, but he's also over the military, and that keeps civilian control over the military, and that is to prevent tyranny. So that was done for a very specific reason by our founding fathers. He is the foreign policy leader. That means that he has the job of coming up with our plans and procedures with dealing with other countries. He can negotiate treaties with other countries. He can receive foreign ambassadors. He can direct the activities of our own ambassadors in its diplomatic affairs. Diplomacy is the art of negotiating with foreign governments, and so he kind of deals with that and manages all of that policy. He also can recognize a foreign government. If a new government takes over, he recognizes it or doesn't recognize it. So he has a lot of power when it comes to being the foreign policy leader, and that's a very significant role that he has, and that's one that he kind of almost has more exclusively. Congress has very little say-so over foreign policy. They can pass laws, but it would have to get through him first. The next thing we see is this chief agenda setter, and this is kind of one of those it's kind of official but unofficial as well. He will give the State of the Union address every year, which is constitutionally mandated. So that's what makes it somewhat official. And in that State of the Union, he includes a number of specific programs that he wants to Congress to pass and put into law. He can help Congress. He helps Congress prepare the federal budget every year, and those are official duties that he has. But the unofficial side of that is he proposes bills to Congress that, which is not necessarily a constitutional duty, but he can do that, and they don't have to take it up, but he can encourage them to do so. So he also, as the president, he has what's called the bully pulpit, which means that he has the public's attention more than any other political leader we have. And as such, he can kind of guide the nation to the agenda that he wants to set for the country. And so that's more of an unofficial role, but it's a very powerful role indeed. Unofficially, he is the chief of state, which means that he is the head of state. He is the symbolic figurehead of our country. So in England, you have the Queen of England, who is the chief of state there. Well, here we have our president, and whoever the president is, they represent our country at major functions. So if a foreign leader dies, he might go and represent our country. He could have at international sporting events, he might represent our country. He might have foreign leaders into the White House to have a formal meal and things like that, and host and represent our country. So as the chief of state, he represents our country officially in various roles and events throughout the world. He is also the party leader. So whatever party he belongs to, he is the leader of that party. So right now, President Biden is the president, and he is a Democrat. So he is the leader of the Democratic Party, and he kind of sets the agenda for that party. He also names, well, at least in the Republican side, they name the president usually gets to kind of pick who's going to be the leader, the head of the committee, the national committee. I don't know if they do that on the Democratic side or not. But anyway, he is the leader of his party, and he's also considered the chief citizen of the country, which means that they are the ones that, the president and the vice president are the only two people that are elected nationwide. And as such, they represent our nation, and they're the primary representative. So that makes them the chief citizen, and kind of goes along with the chief of state. But they are often held to a high standard of personal behavior by the public because of that. Okay, so let's move on and look at what are the formal characteristics of the presidency. Well, there's quite a few that we'll consider. He is the head of the executive branch and responsible for running government programs and implementing laws passed by Congress, which means he's in charge of this branch of government. He makes sure that the programs are run. He makes sure that the laws are passed by Congress. Those are his formal characteristics. His qualifications constitutionally, there are just three in the Constitution that require that the president has to meet. He or she must be at least 35 years old. He or she must have lived in the country for at least 14 years. So you can have lived outside of the country, but if you have not lived in our country for at least 14 years, you still have to be a natural-born citizen, which is our last one that is required. You have to be a natural-born citizen, but you also have to have lived in the country for at least 14 years. You can't have been a natural-born citizen who lived outside the country all your life and then come back and lived here for 2 years and then run for president. They just won't allow that. And the reason is they wanted, when they put that in, they wanted as little foreign influence as possible over our president. So they felt like it needed to be somebody that had a significant amount of time living within the country. And as a natural-born citizen means he or she either has to be born in the United States, which automatically makes them a natural-born citizen, or they can be the child of a person who is a citizen of the United States. And if so, even if they're born in another country, they are technically a natural-born citizen. And I'll give you an example. In 2016, Ted Cruz was running for the nomination for the Republican Party for president. He's a senator from Texas. Well, he was born in Canada. So how does he get to be a natural-born citizen? Well, because his parents were citizens of the United States. And as such, when he was born, even if he was born in Canada, he is a natural-born citizen of the United States of America. Okay? So let's move on and look at what let's talk before we get to that. Let's talk about the term of office. I didn't put that in your notes, but basically, the president serves 4-year terms, and that's the reason for that. Our founding fathers wanted the term to be long enough for them to be able to implement policy and do things, but they didn't want it to be so long that they would become too powerful. And today we have the amendment to the Constitution, which only allows a president to serve 2 full terms. And there's other things in there that we won't talk about right now. But anyway, President Franklin Roosevelt, this was before the Constitution had been amended to limit the terms, and he was elected 4 times, although he died shortly after his 4th term began. But after him, they passed that amendment that no one could, it was the 22nd Amendment. They passed it in 1951 so that no one could serve more than 2 terms. Now, how does the president get elected? In other words, who elects the president and how many electors does each state get? Well, that kind of second question kind of answers the first. But the Electoral College elects the president. It's not by popular vote nationwide. And a lot of people don't understand that and don't understand the reasoning behind it. But I'll get to that in just a moment. Basically, it's the Electoral College, and each state gets a certain number of electors, and those electors meet in December and they cast their ballots for the president and for the vice president, and so they elect the president and the vice president. Now, how do we determine how many electors each state gets? Well, each state gets 1 elector for every senator and every representative that it has in Congress. So we've talked a lot in the legislative branch about every state gets how many senators? They get 2. So we know that every state is going to get at least 2 electors because every state has 2 senators. And we also know that the number of representatives a state gets is based upon its population, but they have to have at least 1. So we know that the minimum number of electors that a state can have is 3, 2 for its senators and 1 for its representative. So like Wyoming, for instance, is a very small state with less than 600,000 people in population. So they have 2 senators, 1 representative, therefore they have 3 electors. Texas has 2 senators and 36 representatives, so we have 38 electoral votes. Florida has 27 representatives and 2 senators, so they have 29. So that's how that works. Why do we have the Electoral College? I want to talk about that for just a moment. Our founding fathers had 2 reasons for the Electoral College. One is, and we've talked about this before, but one is that they wanted to keep some parts of the government more insulated from the people because they just did not believe, remember, they didn't want to found a democracy, and they didn't want a government that would be so controlled by the temporary passions of people, and they tried to insulate different aspects of our government from that. That's why representatives are elected directly by the people every 2 years. They're meant to represent the people closely, but senators are a little further away, presidents a little further away. The justices on the Supreme Court are even further away than that. But they wanted to, that was part of the reason, they wanted to have a president that wouldn't necessarily be controlled by temporary passions and fads and things in the public. The second reason is, and today, the way it's done today, kind of that point doesn't even really matter anymore. But the second reason, and I think the most significant reason, is because, and this is what the founding fathers argued over, because the large states like Virginia wanted it to be elected by popular vote. But the small states like New Jersey and others were like, well, you can't do that because then we'll never get a say in who the president is, and nothing that's important to us will ever be considered, and you will have a tyranny or a dictatorship over us. And so they wanted to avoid that possible. And this was a way, the Electoral College was a way that, even though it's not purely democratic, remember, we have a republic, not a democracy, this was a way that every state would have to be considered. As it stands now, if you went simply by popular vote, really a very small handful of states would elect our president, and those would be the very large states like California, Texas, New York, Illinois, maybe Florida, although I think Florida is surpassing New York now in population. But anyway, it would just be a small handful of states that would always elect the president. Well, within those states, the very large urban areas, like in New York, you have almost 10 million people in New York City. Los Angeles has multiple millions of people. Houston has 4 million people, I believe. So, even within those large states, you would have your large urban areas, which would basically elect the president. So you have really a few, not just a few states, but a few cities that would elect our president. Well, the needs in the cities and the large states are going to be different than the needs in smaller states and small and rural areas. And so the Electoral College was a way that they could give the states themselves some representation in who elects the president. And so that, the states like Wyoming and Iowa that are smaller states would have at least some say in who gets elected the president. And whoever's running for president is going to have to appeal to people across a broad spectrum of states with a broad spectrum of issues. If it was a popular vote, they would just have to appeal to the people in the few largest cities with those issues, and no other issues would be considered. And so that wouldn't really work for a republic, because in a republic you're looking out for those who are not in the majority as well. And so that's one of the reasons. So even though there is a push to get rid of the Electoral College today, I think that would be a huge mistake, because then you would have states that just would not have a say in our government at all anymore. And that's not the way our country was set up. Second question we look at is, which amendment states that the vice president will become president if there is a presidential vacancy? And believe it or not, this was not an issue that was addressed in the original Constitution. That's why we had to have the 25th Amendment, which stated specifically that if something happens to the president, the vice president would become the president. Now, the first time this issue came up, remember the Constitution was written in 1787 and ratified in 1789 and became in effect that year. The first time this really was an issue was in 1841 when William Henry Harrison died shortly after becoming president. Well, John Tyler was his vice president. So there was vigorous debate over whether John Tyler was going to become the president or whether he would just be acting president until a new president was elected. And there's nothing in the Constitution says we can have an earlier election. So the way it worked out is he assumed the power of the office of the presidency and the title of the president as well. And so that kind of became the way it was. So every time a president died or was assassinated after that, and there were 4 after that point that were assassinated, that's the way it worked. Well, the 25th Amendment made it official that when the president dies or leaves office for some reason, the vice president becomes the president. Now, before the 25th Amendment, if the vice president became president, there just was no vice president for the remainder of that term. Well, now in the 25th Amendment, they added that the new president, would then appoint a vice president subject to confirmation by the Senate. Okay, so let's look at what benefits and salary the president and the vice president get in office. The president earns $400,000 per year. Now, there have been 3 presidents in our history, and it used to be less than that. It's changed over the years, and Congress can change it. When they change it, it cannot go in effect during the current term of the presidency, and that's so that they can't manipulate the president with bigger salary or less salary or something like that. So it changes depending on what Congress has, but it's been at $400,000 for a while. But we've had 3 presidents who have not taken a salary. President Herbert Hoover, President John F. Kennedy, and President Donald Trump did not take salaries because they were all very wealthy men. So they didn't really need the salary. So they donated their salary to other good causes or whatever causes that they felt were important. The vice president makes $208,100 per year. Now, that seems like an odd number to me, and I don't know where they came up with that particular number, but that's what he or she makes. But they also get other benefits. They get travel allowances. So the president gets to travel around on Air Force One. The vice president travels around on Air Force Two. Now, once they leave office, they don't necessarily fly on those planes, but they do get some travel allowances. They have staff, people that work with them, that are their assistants, that are their advisors and things like that. And part of their staff includes the Secret Service, and they have Secret Service protection for the remainder of their life, unless they just ask not to have it. They also get a tax deduction for having 2 residencies, because now they're living in the White House, or the vice president lives in the Naval Observatory home. And so they have deduction for 2 residency, and they also have health and retirement benefits. They continue to receive their salary for the remainder of their life, and they also have health coverage as well. Okay. And so the last thing we want to look at today is, what are the informal qualifications for the presidency? We've looked at the formal, and we saw that there were 3. Got to be 35 years old. You have to be a natural-born citizen of the U.S., and you have to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. So what are the informal qualifications? What are things that most presidents are probably going to need to have in order to get elected? Well, they need to be likable. If they're not likable, the chances are they're not going to be elected. Now, there was an exception to that in 2016. You had 2 candidates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, which had both very high unfavorable ratings. And so most people were not really, it was just kind of a weird election. So whichever one you would have elected would have been in very much unfavorable to the majority of the people. And so that was kind of an odd situation. But normally they need to be somebody that's likable. They need to be a strong leader, someone who can assert themselves and their opinion in a way that appeals to the public. They need to communicate effectively. If they don't communicate effectively and get their message across, they'll never get elected president. So they have to be able to get their message across. And that doesn't mean just being a good speaker. There are a lot of things that go with communicating effectively. They need to be persuasive. You need to be able to convince people to come over to your side and to promote your policies. They need to be inspiring and encourage people to be, good Americans or whatever the case may be. I remember when I was 10 and Ronald Reagan was running for president against Jimmy Carter. This would have been 1980. And we were coming off the heels of the Vietnam War, which had demoralized a lot of people and turned people against the government. You had Watergate, which had turned people against the government. Then when Jimmy Carter was president, we had high inflation and stagnant economy. Things were just not good, and people were not feeling good about being Americans. But one of the things that I remember specifically about President Reagan when he was running for office and after he became president was that he inspired people and he encouraged people and he made people feel good to be Americans again, which was something that they hadn't felt in at least 10 years. So that was one of the reasons he won such a big margin in the election. They need to appear dignified. Now, that doesn't always happen, but most of the time they need to appear dignified. They need to be level-headed and make good decisions, not just rash decisions. And they need to, in command. I guess I didn't finish typing out the word. They need to be in command. In other words, they need to come across as if they are in charge. If they don't, then they're not going to do well. All right. If you have any questions, please let me know. Make sure that you submit this for a grade and have a good day.